What happens when aggression meets discipline? A lesson these bikers won't forget. It was a breezy Saturday evening at a small park on the edge of Fairfield, Connecticut. The kind of evening where families gathered, kids played soccer, and teens sat on benches with earbuds in, scrolling through their phones. 16-year-old Ethan was one of them, sitting by himself under a tall oak tree. His younger brother, Noah, was finishing up soccer practice, and Ethan had promised their mom he'd wait to walk him home. Ethan, wearing a fitted black suit with a crisp white shirt and polished black shoes, kept to himself, casually flipping through a book he'd brought along. He didn't look up when the rumble of motorcycles broke through the air. It was the type of sound that usually didn't mean much. Just a group of bikers passing through, their engines echoing louder than they should in a quiet space. But tonight, something was different. The bikers didn't pass through. Instead, they rolled in, parking their bikes near the soccer field. 5 of them, dressed in leather jackets and dark jeans, stood out in sharp contrast to the families gathered around. They weren't laughing or chatting among themselves. They were scanning the park, their eyes locking onto Ethan as if he were a target. Ethan noticed them too. He glanced up briefly, catching their stares. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the way they looked at him made his stomach knot slightly. He turned back to his book, forcing himself to stay calm. But calm doesn't last long when you're being watched. The bikers didn't stay by their bikes. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, nudged his friend and started walking toward Ethan. And that's when things began to shift. Ethan felt the man's heavy footsteps before he saw him clearly. He glanced up only to find the burly biker flanked by 2 others, their expressions unreadable but intent. The group moved with purpose, their leather boots crunching against the gravel pathway as they closed the distance. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, but his face remained calm. His mom always said, "Never let them see you sweat." He thought of her voice, steady and grounding, as he dog-eared the page in his book and set it aside. "What are you doing here, kid?" the burly man asked, his voice gruff and direct. Ethan hesitated, his eyebrows knitting slightly in confusion. "Waiting for my brother," he replied simply, his tone polite but firm. The man smirked, exchanging a glance with his friends. "This doesn't look like your kind of place," he said, his words laced with something unspoken but pointed. Ethan's jaw tightened, though he forced himself to remain composed. "It's a public park," he answered, meeting the man's gaze. The biker's smirk faded. "Got a smart mouth, huh?" he said, stepping closer. The other 2 spread out slightly, creating a semicircle around Ethan. Parents and kids were still scattered around the park, but no one seemed to notice the tension building under the oak tree. Ethan scanned the area briefly, hoping someone would look his way. But the bikers had chosen their moment well. Most of the attention was on the soccer field, where Noah's game was wrapping up. Ethan's mind raced. He wasn't scared, not yet. But the situation was turning, and he could feel it. Years of karate training had taught him to observe, anticipate, and react. But he also knew discipline. Fighting wasn't the first option. It was the last. "Look," Ethan said, keeping his tone measured. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just here for my brother." But the burly man didn't back off. Instead, he leaned down slightly, his face just a little too close for comfort. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble?" he asked, his voice low and taunting. Ethan could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken challenge in their posture. His hands rested loosely on his knees, but he was ready if it came to that. And yet, something about the man's next words made it clear they weren't going to let him off that easily. "Maybe you should show us what you've got," the biker sneered, his friends laughing quietly behind him. But Ethan didn't move yet. He didn't flinch. His hands stayed where they were, resting calmly on his knees, but his eyes stayed locked on the man in front of him. Years of practice had taught him how to read people, how their posture, their movements, even their breathing could give away their intentions. And these men? They weren't here to talk. The burly man, clearly expecting Ethan to fold under the pressure, leaned closer, his shadow falling over him. "What's the matter, kid? You scared?" he taunted. Ethan exhaled slowly, not answering right away. He didn't need to. Fear wasn't the issue here. His issue was time. How long until Noah's game ended? How long until someone in the park noticed what was going on? "Leave him alone," the sudden voice broke through the tension. Ethan turned his head slightly to see a young boy, no older than 10, standing a few yards away. Noah, his little brother, had wandered off the field, sweat still glistening on his forehead from the game. "Noah, stay back," Ethan called, his voice firm. But the bikers turned toward the boy, grinning like predators spotting an easier target. "This your brother?" one of them asked, pointing a gloved finger at Noah. "Maybe we should teach you both a lesson." Ethan felt his pulse quicken, but not with fear, with resolve. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving the group. He shifted his weight slightly, planting his feet in the stance he'd practiced countless times in the dojo. "Don't touch him," Ethan said, his voice calm but edged with steel. The burly man laughed, shaking his head. "Look at this guy, thinks he's tough." The others joined in, their laughter echoing across the park. But Ethan didn't waver. His expression didn't change, and his stance didn't shift. His silence unnerved them more than he realized. "You're not going to do anything," one of the bikers said, stepping closer. And that's when Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You don't want to do this." The laughter stopped. The bikers glanced at each other, confused for a moment by the confidence in his tone. But the moment didn't last. The burly man took another step forward, raising a hand to shove Ethan. What happened next was so fast, so unexpected, that even the bikers weren't ready for it. But Ethan was. The burly biker's hand shot forward, aiming to shove Ethan's shoulder. But before it could connect, Ethan shifted to the side with practiced precision, his body moving like a spring released. The biker stumbled slightly, caught off guard, but Ethan didn't stop there. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, his open palm striking the man's wrist and twisting it away. The biker grunted in pain, his hand dropping to his side as he stepped back, glaring at Ethan with fury in his eyes. "What the?" the man started. But before he could finish, Ethan spoke. "I warned you," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. The two other bikers rushed forward, clearly not taking the warning seriously. The first swung a wild punch, but Ethan ducked easily, his movement smooth and deliberate. He countered with a sharp kick to the man's knee, sending him crumpling to the ground with a cry of pain. The second man hesitated for a split second, just long enough for Ethan to pivot on his heel and deliver a spinning kick to the side of his ribs. The force knocked the wind out of him, and he staggered backward, clutching his side. By now, the burly leader had recovered, his face red with anger. He lunged at Ethan, swinging both fists like a brawler. But Ethan didn't meet brute force with brute force. He stayed light on his feet, dodging the punches with the kind of agility that came from years of training. A crowd began to gather at the edge of the park. Parents, kids, even soccer players stopped what they were doing to watch. Someone had pulled out a phone, the lens capturing every second of what was unfolding. The leader charged again, this time trying to grab Ethan by the lapel of his suit jacket. But Ethan moved faster, twisting out of his grip and delivering a precise strike to the man's solar plexus. The biker stumbled backward, gasping for air, his tough exterior cracking in the face of Ethan's calm control. "Enough," Ethan said, his voice loud enough to echo across the park. His stance remained strong, but his expression showed no malice, only resolve. "I don't want to hurt you. Walk away." For a moment, it seemed like the bikers might listen. The leader wheezed, holding his chest as he glared at Ethan. The two others were still on the ground, one clutching his knee and the other his ribs. The tension in the air was thick, but Ethan didn't flinch. "Let's go," the leader finally growled, waving at his friends to follow. They limped back to their bikes, muttering curses under their breath as they started their engines. But just as they began to pull away, the leader turned back, pointing a finger at Ethan. "This ain't over, kid," he spat before roaring off with his crew. Ethan didn't respond. He stood there, his breathing steady, as the sound of their engines faded into the distance. Around him, the crowd began to applaud, murmurs of admiration and disbelief rippling through the group. Noah ran up to him, his eyes wide with both fear and awe. "Ethan, are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ethan knelt down, putting a hand on his brother's shoulder. "I'm fine," he said, offering a small smile. "Let's go home." But as they walked away, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. The walk home. Ethan and Noah walked home in silence, their sneakers tapping softly against the sidewalk. Noah kept sneaking glances at his older brother, his expression a mix of awe and worry. Finally, he couldn't hold it in any longer. "Ethan," Noah said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how did you do all that? I mean, they were huge, and there were 3 of them." Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not about being bigger, Noah," he explained. "It's about being prepared, staying calm, and knowing when to act." Noah frowned. But what if they come back? That guy said it wasn't over. Ethan stopped walking, turning to face his little brother. If they do, we'll handle it. But listen to me, Noah, he said, his tone serious. What happened today wasn't about fighting. It was about standing up for myself and for you. But violence isn't the answer, unless it's the only option. Noah nodded slowly, processing his brother's words. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Remember, it's not about proving how strong you are. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. When they got home, their mom was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, and a concerned look on her face. You're late, she said, her voice tinged with worry. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Noah, who stayed quiet. Something happened at the park, Ethan admitted, choosing his words carefully. He didn't want to worry her more than necessary, but he also believed in honesty. As he recounted the story, their mom's expression shifted from fear to pride. She listened intently, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes glistened with emotion. Ethan, she said when he finished, I'm proud of you for protecting your brother and yourself. But promise me one thing, don't ever take risks like that unless you have no other choice. I promise, Ethan replied, and he meant it. A quiet sense of purpose. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he replayed the events in his mind. He thought about the bikers' aggression, the crowd's reaction, and the lingering words of the leader, "This ain't over, kid." But Ethan wasn't afraid. He'd learned long ago that fear only had power if you let it. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of purpose. The world wasn't always fair, but moments like this proved that courage and discipline could make a difference. And somewhere deep down, he knew this experience wasn't just a test of his skills. It was a reminder that standing up against wrongs, no matter how daunting, was always worth it. Ethan's story is a powerful example of resilience, preparation, and knowing when to take a stand. His calm confidence in the face of adversity teaches us that true strength isn't about size or intimidation. It's about knowing your worth and acting with integrity. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on how you can stand up for yourself or others in difficult situations. And remember, courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing the right thing even when fear is present.